Hello and welcome to the first tutorial on the painting process. Before we can go into 3D Code, I took a new Maya scene and I imported our pillar, which is currently split into two parts. But what I'd like to do is take the whole thing and separate it into multiple pieces. I'm getting them out of the groups. And I'm going to give these pieces names that make sense so that in 3D Code we can hide some of the pieces, for example the top ornament, so that we are able to paint under it if it's needed. And this will make it a bit easier for us to paint the whole thing. So I'm going ahead and do this. And now with the proper naming of the pieces, this makes it a lot easier for me to identify what I'm painting on in 3D Code. What you need to do is simply get all the pieces and export the selection as a OBJ, and I'm going to see you with your model in 3D Code. Okay, in 3D Code I'm going to make a new file, and what we're going to do is we are going to paint over a UV mapped mesh. So I'm going to find my mesh, I'm setting the texture size to 2K, and I'm going to hit OK. And here we have our mesh already. And as you can see, in Paint Objects, we can now easily hide the pieces that we would like to paint on, or by clicking it with Alt, we can isolate these two. Before I do any painting, I have to set a few things up. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I go to Textures, and I'm going to import my normal map, which we've done earlier. For this, I'm going to invert the green channel because 3D Code displays the normal maps differently than Maya or Marmoset. And there we have our normal map. Second thing I will do is I go into textures again and I'm going to calculate the occlusion. I'm going to use sphere and hemisphere, and I keep the light count at 1022, and as post smoothing steps I'm going to use 10. These are settings that work quite okay for me, but you can of course play around with these, and I'm hitting OK. And what this is doing is it's going to bake you an ambient occlusion map right inside 3D Code. Once this is done, 3D Code made already some layers for the ambient occlusion and the normal map, and I'm just going to add 3D Code here because I also have made another normal map from XNormal, and later we'll be compositing them together. The normal map is the one we've used from XNormal, so I'm going to keep this. Okay, next thing we can do before we start painting, I'm going to hide my ambient occlusion and normal map. Then I'm going into front view, and I'm going to my paint bucket tool and select the gradient mode. And what it does, it creates a line for you, and this is where we're going to place a gradient on the model. So I'm going to take the top part and drag it up by holding shift, and the bottom part and pull it down. So this is where the gradient will be placed. And the colors we're using are close to being black and close to being white. I don't like to use pure white and pure black because it doesn't look very good and those colors rarely appear in nature. So take something that's not so close to being the pure color. And once this is done, you can check how it's going to look like in your material preview. And this will give you a good example of how the gradient is going to look like. If we hit 2 on the keyboard, we are in unlit mode. But my layer right now, let's make a new one, is set up with roughness and metalness. So I'm going to remove that, and this is how our gradient is going to look like. And now we simply click on each part of the object and fill them with the gradient. and this one too. Once this is done, I'm going to name the layer gradient, and I'm going to use an overlay, and I'm going to put the opacity a bit lower because I don't want this effect to be so strong, just something that your eye picks up more subconsciously. Now we're going to add some larger shadow and light information, and for this I'm going to turn off the ambient occlusion and the normal map so that I just have the model, and I'm calling this one shadows large, and I'm going to use a very soft brush and I'm going to make it quite black. And again I remove the roughness and metalness, and then I can start painting some shadows in. If I hit W, I can see the wireframe of my mesh so that I know where the borders are. Okay, so I'm going to set the layer on multiply. Also going to lower the opacity for my brush to 50%. And then I can start painting some shadows in. Just very rough. So below all these pieces that will cast a shadow to under these shapes here. Because we're going to paint most of the lighting information into our textures. So this one might cast a shadow around here. And of course the downside of this object also is in the shadows. When you do this, painting in light and shadow information, what I do is I just imagine a light source that comes from the top left of the object, for example, and then I paint with this in mind. If you want to change the size of the brush, you can do so by holding the right mouse button or whatever that is mapped to your pen and just drag it to the side. So you don't have to go up here and change the radius. And I'm just going to apply this technique to the whole model. And as you can see, I'm doing this quite quickly because later I'm going to scale down the opacity of the layer so it's not that visible, but it adds a nicer effect to it when we have all the textures applied. Okay, now that I have done this, I'm going to turn on my ambient occlusion layer. And I'm going to do some tweaking here. I'm going to reduce the opacity of my ambient occlusion to 80. And for my shadows, I'm going to lower this as well, so that these are a bit more subtle, but this gives us a nice contrast. Next thing is I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to paint in some lights. So for this, I'm going to get the same kind of brush, but this time I'm going to do the opposite, which is taking a bright brush, and I'm going to illuminate large areas. Going into overlay mode for this, and I'm lowering the opacity, and I'm just highlighting the large faces of the model. So everything that is big open face, I'm going to add some lighting here. So that it pops out, and that gives it a nice contrast. And again, this is very rough. I don't paint any details in just yet. It's just preparation for the actual painting. Also, I want to highlight the ornament, so I want that to be seen. Okay, and this has added some highlights to our model. Together with the shadows, this already gives us some good information of the lights and darks of the model, and creates a nice contrast even without having any color applied. But as you can see, this already looks pretty much like a good base for a pillar, and all we need to do next is to add some color information and some more details.